Hi, That's So Hindu listeners. This week we've got another special episode with HAF's Devala Rees. This time we're talking about why HAF has been using the term Hindu Dharma Traditions wherever it makes sense rather than Hinduism, plus how many different traditions there are under that banner, their similarities, differences, and how they relate to other Dharma traditions. So, over the past 18 months here at HAF, we've been transitioning away from using the term Hinduism. We're not changing the name of the organization, nor are we never using the term again. But wherever it makes sense, we're working in using Hindu Dharma traditions instead. Why is that?
It's because there are many different Hindu Dharma traditions. There's not just one. It's just factually more accurate to speak of them in this way. The word Hinduism is familiar, but it was actually coined by an evangelical Christian missionary during the British colonial period in India, and it lumps together many different traditions under one umbrella term, which was viewing it as a religion from a rather Christian perspective, and it erases a lot of important distinctions between these traditions, and it lends itself to practices or traditions, to practices or teachings that are specific to one of these traditions getting misapplied to Hinduism as a whole, and it just tends to promote misconceptions and misunderstandings, whereas referring to them as traditions plural is more accurate.
So if we have multiple spiritual traditions, two things. You can take these in any order you want. If we're talking about multiple traditions, what are the uniting factors that makes the phrase Hindu Dharma traditions both a singular and a plural phrase, because we can take them all together? And two, there are a decent number, perhaps fewer than there used to be, of people who are basically ideological Hindu haters, it seems to me, who like to say that Hinduism doesn't actually exist, and they'll say Hindu Dharma traditions doesn't actually exist, or it's a construct of Hindu supremacists or something like that. Doesn't that just feed into it, what you're saying, that there's so many multiple traditions and, you know, it didn't exist before 18 whatever? How do we square that?
Sure. Okay, I'll take those in the order you asked. So what are the uniting factors? So there's all the Dharma traditions, which have many uniting factors, not only the Hindu ones. And actually drawing a line between Hindu Dharma traditions and non-Hindu Dharma traditions is not a very simple thing to do. The uniting factors among all the Dharma traditions, they all seek ways to alleviate suffering, the experience of suffering by living beings, primarily humans, since that's who's practicing these traditions. All of them teach pluralism, compassion, methods for self-discovery, self-management in life. All of them promote the value of seva, or selfless service to others. All of them share a concept of dharma, although they do use the term dharma in a variety of ways, but they all do use the term. Not technically all, because you can go dig up exceptions, but most of them share many more foundational concepts, and especially the Hindu ones here, like samsara, or the cyclical nature of ups and downs in life, karma, or action and its effects, moksha, or freedom from the cycles of suffering, dharma, sadhana, or spiritual practices like dhyana or meditation. Especially those are all across all the Dharma traditions, especially with Hindu Dharma traditions, Atman, or a concept of self, Brahman or Ishvara, the ultimate reality or supreme being, speaking of Jagat as the multiverse, concepts like this that they all have in common. But the ways that they use them and apply them differ significantly from tradition to tradition. As for those particular brands of Hindu haters, yeah, that's real. There are those people who say that Hinduism doesn't actually exist, or so on. I think what feeds into the ideological Hindu haters more is actually to say that there is, or to imply that there is one homogeneous Hinduism, because based on that premise, they can then go cherry pick any verse from any source, any guru, any legal code, any text from the whole history of Hindus, and portray it as part of Hinduism, even if the vast majority of Hindus throughout history and today never followed that or never considered it to be part of their tradition. Hinduism, so saying that, does Hinduism actually exist? Hinduism does actually exist in the sense of a religion constructed in modern times, not by Hindu supremacists, as they might say, but by Hindus who need legal protections for our religious rights and freedoms in a modern world which bases such protections on the concept of world religions. So in that context, Hinduism needs to be a world religion. So it's construed as such for the protection of Hindus' rights. That remains perfectly valid today in the legal sphere. But when it comes to accurately understanding the actual traditions that Hindus practice, that really requires understanding that there are many distinct Hindu Dharma traditions which have important differences from one another. If you're going to say Hinduism didn't exist before 1850s or whatever, as one unified religion in the modern sense, I would honestly be inclined to agree with you. But in terms of the Dharma traditions, Hindu Dharma traditions that people practice, most of those, there are new ones, most of those have quite objectively been around for thousands of years.
Okay. So we're talking about thousands of years of tradition, multiple traditions. I know you've looked into this, and there is a number. How many are there?
Dharma traditions or Hindu Dharma?
Let's stick with the Hindu Dharma traditions, and then we'll move on to the middle word in that phrase.
Sure. More than 300. The exact number is hard to pin down because many of these are tribal traditions that aren't recorded in written sources. And so it would take a extremely arduous anthropological survey through every little tribal community in India to count them, but certainly more than 300 is what we're talking about.
Let's go on to those tribals for something. It wasn't something that I was originally thinking of asking, but since you brought it up, some of the same ideological Hindu haters out there will talk about some of these tribal groups, their traditions being subsumed into some sort of Borg-like modern Hindu nationalist Hinduism thing out there. How can you go into that a little bit? Is that something that you can flesh out for people? How some of these traditions that are rooted in tribal communities have things in common and can accurately be put into the Hindu Dharma traditions bucket without necessarily saying that you are part of some monolithic, version of Hinduism?
Yeah. Well, they're certainly not monolithic. They have their own very distinct practices. They're often their own deities, their own ancestral customs. They do their own ceremonies, which are all different from each other. That's why we're saying they're different traditions. Very different in terms of like what ceremonies do you practice, what spiritual techniques do you do. There might be more difference than overlap, at least unless you get down to the level of very broad foundational concepts between any two of those traditions, or between any two of them and or any of the pan-regional ones that might be kind of a template for what such a person might be referring to as quote unquote mainstream Hinduism, although there isn't any one tradition that could be identified as mainstream. But on the point of getting assimilated into this kind of homogenized conglomerate, who's doing the assimilating? Hindu missionaries aren't going to these tribes and saying, get with the program. The tribes do it themselves from their side because they want to, in cases where they do want to, in cases where, you'll hear about people talking about Sanskritization or so on. It's not like Sanskrit missionaries are going to the tribes. The tribes, some of the tribes, have chosen to Sanskritize themselves. The tribes were always the one who did that because it was for the same reason that anyone might like to learn a widespread, dominant pan-regional language for better trading relationships and to integrate into a broader society around them. If many of the tribes found it advantageous to do that, they were welcomed into the fold. Often within the tribe, they maintained their own tribal-specific dharma practices. In speaking to outsiders frequently they adopted more pan-regional Sanskritic ways of talking to interface with outside society. That was done on the tribal initiative. That was never imposed on them. So that's a pretty important distinction that such allegations often totally miss.
Okay, then let's go back to that big number, 300 something.
Yeah.
Can you give listeners an idea of the breadth? I don't know if there's some very convenient examples of the range of things that we're talking about here, very antithetical things. I mean, the one that pops to mind for me is how some Agori Baba who lives in a cremation ground and drinks out of a skull bowl and is frankly high off his mind the entire day as a spiritual practice. I have been around these people.
Yeah, me too.
Is in the same. I've partaken with these people sometimes. Is in the same category of spiritual traditions as, say, BAPS, an order, modern order, who has separation. Their monks have very little to no interaction with females, and separate things out. Or even a Ramakrishna mission. I've been in the one in Delhi. I came in the back once and didn't realize I was sitting on the female side because everyone's back was to me. It was the middle of winter and everyone had shawls around them, and I just didn't know. I'd never been.
Yeah. And
how do or ISKCON, or somebody that thinks that taking a drop of alcohol is the greatest, sin, to mix Christian terms in there, in the world. How do we square that? How do we bring those all together?
Well, you're kind of getting right there at why it's problematic to just refer to Hinduism as if it's one Hinduism, when the BAPS people or ISKCON certainly do not consider themselves to be practicing the same tradition as the Agori, or vice versa. They're practicing very, very different traditions. So that's a pretty stark example of why we're talking about it's useful to talk of these as plural. Do they have anything to do with each other? Yeah, they share all the things. They all, the Agori and BAPS alike, equally speak of samsara and actually share, for the most part, common understandings of what samsara is and what moksha is. In terms of the broadest implications, they're taking different paths to get there, and they may or may not share a common reverence for the Vedas as an authoritative source that they're using. Some of the
just one pause right there. Because that runs counter to actually the Indian Supreme Court definition of who is Hindu.
Yes, it does. The Indian Supreme Court definition of who is Hindu. One of the factors. I think the first thing, if I recall off the top of my head, I could pull it out someplace, is identifying as Hindu. So that may supersede, but the distinction between who holds reverence for the Vedas and not is often cited, in my understanding, and I said this on a different show that I do, as a distinction between who is in the Hindu Dharma Traditions bucket and who is in the bigger Dharma Traditions bucket. Yes, it is. The Indian Supreme Court did say they accepted a definition of acceptance of the Vedas with reference, recognition of the fact that the number of gods to be worshipped is large. Yes, there were a few other points that they put in there. It gets problematic because you have it's well and good to take a Buddhist or a Jain or a Sikh who doesn't accept the Vedas as a source of authority and say, well, okay, they're dharmic, but they're not Hindu. Fine. But there are plenty of agamic Vaishnavas and Shaivas and Shaktas venerating Vishnu who don't take the Vedas as a source of authority. Those people, where are you going to call? Are you not going to call them Hindu? Plenty of them call themselves Hindu. And yet the Vedas hold no place among the sources used in their tradition. For some Vaishnavas, they certainly do. For others, they don't, who are based purely on the Pancharatra Agamas in Tamil Nadu, for instance, or many of the Tantric Shaiva and Shakta traditions go back many thousands of years. They call themselves Hindu. If anyone who looked in India who looked at their practices would call them Hindus, and they don't all take the Vedas as any part of their authoritative system. Some do, some don't. a lot of these definitions, even in the Indian Supreme Court, were based off of British colonial era scholarship of Hinduism, which was very narrow and left a whole lot of people out because they were coming at religion. These scholars were coming at religion from an Abrahamic paradigm where it's based on a Bible or a Quran or what have you. They wanted there to be a foundational scripture. And the Vedas seemed like the best candidate because a lot of people based their authoritative structures on it, but not everybody did, including people who are in as much in the Hindu bucket as anyone in terms of popular usage and even self-identification. And part of this gets to another difference, which is that native dharmic views don't place a high premium on belief; they place a high premium on practice. So, to a native pre-colonial dharmic practitioner, do you believe that the Vedas are true? Is not a very important question. The important question is, do you use them? Are your practices derived from them or not? You might theoretically believe that what they say is true. That doesn't really matter. If you're not citing your philosophy to them, and you might be taking some agamas as what you're basing your practices on as your sources. What you think of the Vedas might not be very relevant. And so frequently colonial scholars would come to people and ask about their beliefs and define their religion according to beliefs. And that was a very niche side topic that very much missed the heart of the way that dharmic peoples were thinking about their own actual traditions.
It's funny, the word belief. My mind is going to the word faith. And the word faith in English.
Similarly with faith.
Yeah, it's something that means something differently to a dharmic practitioner or dharmic follower than it does in an Abrahamic context. So let's go back to the middle of the phrase. We have Hindu Dharma traditions, and then can you just give an overview for listeners? Again, we're pitching this to the general listener who's coming to this, who's searching for something on Hinduism. How to define what is the Dharma traditions more broadly, and then relate them to the Hindu Dharma traditions. What are the similarities, differences? And I got a follow-up question on that that's more political today, but let's keep ourselves in the spiritual for now.
Got it. Generally, the other Dharma traditions, which are very much part of the ancient or descend from the ancient Dharmic milieu in ancient India, that today are typically not considered Hindu, would be the Jain Dharma traditions, I should say, the Buddha Dharma or Buddhism, Sikhi or the Sikhism, the Sikh Dharma tradition. That's a medieval one; it's not ancient. And Zoroastrian. Zoroastrian is the one that tends to most surprise people because it's least often recognized as being part of the Dharma traditions, but it absolutely is in ancient history. It's extremely closely cognate with the Vedas. It was an Aryan tribal tradition of the greater ancient Indosphere reaching into ancient Persia. It shares all sorts of foundational concepts, practices, even linguistically cognate terms for them. I should say Zoroastrianism is an exonym just as much as Hindu is. They call their own tradition Mazdayasana, but hardly anyone knows what that means. So Zoroastrian.
Well, they're not too many Zoroastrians around anymore. Anyway,
not too many, but there's a few 100,000 still.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're talking up against 1.3 billion or something, but still.
Yeah.
Okay, so then. Okay, we'll get on to the political part of this. When we're talking about unity of traditions and factors that bring them all together, I think we have to. I'm going to pause and just say I think we have to do a whole episode on how Zoroastrianism is a Dharma tradition, because I think that's going to be news to a lot of people. So I'll be succinct. What are your thoughts, both conceptually, practically today, on how Hindutva frames the word Hindu? It's if you go back to, the early part of the 20th century, when as a political philosophy, the word Hindutva, became applied to this philosophy. I mean, the term itself goes back to the 19th century, despite what some people like to think. It predates the political tradition. Their definition of the word Hindu is a cultural one. It encompasses everyone practicing a Dharma tradition and who views the historical land of India, which is bigger than the modern nation state, use the word Indosphere. And I think at the time, probably would have been narrower than that. They probably would not have included Persia in that, as a spiritual homeland. Do you think that framing is useful today? One, both politically and religiously. And what about there's some, I've been in the room with people, I've been with a Jain person who says they're Hindu because they're using this culturally.
Yeah.
How do we unpack all of that?
Well, so in terms of conceptually, with the use of the term Hindu, it's really a matter of subjective, personal, preferred usage. The word Hindu is an exonym for everybody from India. It came from outside the traditions. It came from outside India. No Hindu self-identified as a Hindu until quite historically recently. I certainly do think that there's great validity in recognizing that there are certain cultural commonalities among everyone who practices Dharma traditions. Do we need to call them all Hindu? I don't particularly think that is useful. I think that can be contentious to no productive purpose in a lot of contexts.
Yeah.
In the original sense of the word Hindu, it was a geographical term. And in that sense, sure, all the Dharma traditions were Hindu. But that usage has long since shifted. I don't see why we should insist on trying to push what is ultimately an arbitrary and foreign label on anybody who doesn't want it. The more accurate label is simply Dharma. That's what all the traditions themselves actually use. And I think to call them Dharma traditions is something that they would all agree with, and it's more accurate. In terms of like the Indosphere, I do think it's important to recognize that the Indosphere, the historical land of India, so to speak, which is indeed more expansive than the modern Republic of India, is the spiritual homeland of the Dharma traditions. Is that useful politically? I don't particularly think so. I don't think that's going to do anything to improve relations between India and Pakistan, for example. Is it useful spiritually and culturally? I say yes. I do think that framing is useful because a key part of all the Dharma traditions is reciprocal gratitude and honoring the roots of what benefits us. If we who practice any one of these traditions find it valuable in our lives, I think we should learn and remember and honor where it came from. That doesn't mean we owe any political loyalty to the government of any nation in the Indosphere, whether it's the Republic of India or any of the others of Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nepal, but rather it's gratitude and respect and reverence to Mother India or Bharat Mata or Jambudvipa or whatever term is used in your tradition or that resonates with you personally, as the ancient wellspring of these spiritual traditions that are beneficial to us. In that sense, I'm all for it.
Any other thoughts here on Hindu Dharma traditions that you feel like, having looked at the breadth of them, that you feel like we haven't covered that people ought to know to get their heads around this?
Yeah,
right? Both in the sense of the spiritual traditions themselves and perhaps the importance of changing the language around it.
The importance of changing the language is mainly because it has many benefits, but to kind of go back to your point on anti-Hindu haters, I think that a lot of Hindus adopted the term Hinduism to band together for legal protection as recognition as a world religion. But I think we need to recognize that it's a double-edged sword that works well in that context, and I think we should keep doing it in that context legally. But if you say there is one Hinduism, which is a religion, then to go back to this point, anyone who wants can go cherry pick any verse that any so-called Hindu text from history ever used, even if it was only used in one kingdom 1,500 years ago, and your tradition never drew from that as a source, and say, well, Hinduism says this, and cherry pick some line that sounds oppressive or horrible, that's being taken totally out of context and framed as this is from one of the authoritative scriptures of the religion of Hinduism. This is just not an accurate representation of these traditions. It might be something that some group of people in Indian history did do, but why do all the rest of us need to tie ourselves to that if our traditions never did that and may indeed have spent centuries arguing against it? I think that it's very valuable in a lot of contexts and very much in Hindus' interests to start speaking of this as a pluralistic family of related traditions and not as one homogeneous religion in terms of how it functions in reality.
One final thing that's occurring to me.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Hinduism for outsiders is often described as complex and contradictory and paradoxical. Do you think trying to call it Hinduism makes it so? But if you talk about Hindu Dharma traditions, plural, some things aren't paradoxical because you're doing, how about red apple to green apple? They're both apples, but they're different colors and taste very different.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. If you think that Hinduism is one thing, it's absolutely wildly contradictory. This text and that text completely contradict each other. And this was never a problem because those aren't texts from the same tradition. One tradition uses one, the other tradition uses the other. They never considered each other's to be authoritative for them. They're each authoritative for the people who opt into following that particular tradition. They were never supposed to all be reconciled with each other as if they're part of one religion. I think that the perception of Hinduism as muddled and contradictory, which I think afflicts a lot of Hindus, even in modern India, who have a very sort of colonially based understanding of Hinduism from the education system that India inherited from the British period. This causes a great deal of confusion. To understand that the Dharma traditions, even the Hindu Dharma traditions, are plural, I think goes a very long way toward clearing that up. Yeah, I would totally agree with that.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it now with someone who you think will like it too. Please also like, follow, and or subscribe to this show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks again for listening.